Hello, Todd Sanders here. Welcome to Organizing Your First Story Collection. I usually appear at Frostburg's Indie Lit Festival as a book dealer, selling books of science fiction, fantasy, and French in translation. But of course, this year's a little different, so we decided to do this year. My press, the Air Nothingness Press, has been around about 25 years now. Let me just do the window here. I started with translations of Robert Desnos, who was a surrealist poet. I did 5 books of his poetry. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I started doing science fiction and fantasy. We've had 5 books come out this year. Some of you may know me through a Kickstarter campaign for Upon a Once Time, which just wrapped up. That is a book of 21 authors from 8 different countries around the world who are mashing 2 fairy tales up with a genre of their choice. So very apt for what we're going to be talking about today, which is how to organize your short story collection. This has some applicable sense also to organizing poetry collections. Many years ago, I was one of the assistant editors at the Carnegie Mellon Press, and we would do 8 or so books a year of poetry collections. I've also done 4 books of my own poetry, and I help other authors self-publish. So some of this is applicable to poetry as well, but we're going to concentrate more on short stories today. There are 3 topics we're going to address, and I got some notes over here, which is why I keep turning my head. Your opener story, the general structure of the collection, and then the ending story. And all this makes sense either whether you're going to be self-publishing or whether you're sending off a collection to a publisher as a first-time published author. I also do have the chat running in YouTube, so feel free to ask questions, and I know Jennifer's going to help me out with that aspect of this. So to start with, again, as I said, this is for whether you're self-publishing or whether you're submitting to a press. The key story really is your opener, your first story. That can go several different ways. I tend to like a story that's bright, that really shows off your work, that really is going to engage the reader and draw them in. You don't want something that's going to be too dark or too deep to start with, or too long for the most part. It also does not have to be, if you're titling the story collection by one of the stories in the collection, that story does not have to be first, and probably should not be first unless it is also your strongest story. You tend to want to have your readers wade into your book and sort of discover as things go along. That first story then also, you know, it's tough to pick often your best story yourself, because you're of course biased because you're the ones writing them. You've probably been writing for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. You've built up a quality set of work. So I often tell people who I'm helping organize their collections to look to their friends and family, also look to readers who don't know their work, pick maybe 3 or 4 likely stories and see what they think of that as being the strongest one. Because your friends and family, of course, they want to please you. They want to be optimistic and say they're all great. But again, a lot of this time, a lot of people are going to be looking at these stories the first time. They don't know you per se, especially if they're a publisher. They're going to be weighing you against probably other submissions. This is probably part of some larger open call of stories, books that you've been submitting to. So having that kind of outside influence is great to give you a touch point as to what you think, what they think, what you think is going to be that strongest story. Overall, I would say the collection's going to be probably 10 to 12 stories, especially for a first-time author. You don't want to do anything too large, but you want to put your best foot forward. Those 10 or 12, I would also probably print them up and organize them, put them all on the floor. That's often a better way to kind of decide your sort of structure. There are a couple different ways to organize your books, or excuse me, your book through the structure. There's a couple of websites online that talk about that, and I'm going to be using some of their terms just because they seem to be some kind of common terms. There's the Hourglass Structure, which you're going to start with a good, strong theme. You're going to then bring that down into other stories, but have them sort of relate to one another, and then come back out again and have that final story be a relation to the first story. This is especially helpful if you've got a set of stories that are all about the same set of characters, or maybe in the same world, if there's maybe science fiction fantasy. So you want to have those stories relate to one another. There's also called the Mobius Strip, which is a set of stories that are organized to circle back on themselves. So you keep going back to recurring themes. If you're an author, if you're maybe writing something that's suspense or some sort of fantasy set of books or a set of stories. So it's you want to keep a rhythm going that you're always returning every few stories back to that initial kind of theme over and over. There's, of course, the mosaic, which is probably pretty self-explanatory. That's just strictly throwing up an order that you just think that is kind of a collage, setting up your good points, your bad points, stories that are long, stories that are short. You want to set up kind of an internal rhythm to that. I tend to like to pair longer stories or more serious stories with a few lighter ones. So it's not just serious story. You've got a few lighter or a few smaller pieces. Maybe you've done some flash fiction. So maybe you've got a couple stories in there that are 3,000 to 4,000 words. You can then put in a couple 1,000-word stories or less, just to kind of, if you think of this almost like a meal or an orchestra piece, a symphony, you have some heavy bits, you have the various courses of the meal, and then in between you have maybe a little, a amuse-bouche, as it were. There's also what's called the instant replay, and that is a set of stories that often are retelling the same theme, or that if you end a story, let's say you're got a story that ends about somebody digging dirt on a grave, and your next story, you have a story called The Dirt. So that's a way then to link those stories together, that there's an ability to have some inherent quality of one story relate to the next, and that then leads you to the next one, that then leads you to the next one, and the next one. If you have a novella as part of this collection, I would probably put that last, just because that's going to be a larger chunk of a story. You don't want to sort of put that in the middle and have somebody coming along, they're reading all these stories that are 2,000 to 3,000 words, and suddenly they're starting another short story, but it turns out to be a very long one. Especially these days, we're reading on iPads, we're reading on our phones, we're reading while we're traveling, although we're not traveling as much these days as we used to, but you have these short periods. Maybe you're at home working and you only have, 5 or 10 minutes period of time of reading between when you got to get the laundry out, the kids have got to start school and these kind of things. So having that novella be in the center of a book may be a turnoff to some people when they're reading, because they're thinking they're getting into a short story, and again, it becomes a very much longer piece. So I would try to maybe back end those and put a novella in the back is really kind of the weighty piece that's kind of anchoring the whole collection. If you have any overlapping characters, if you're writing a set of stories that are interlocking again with the same characters in the same world, you can have the stories organized so that one character leads to the next, or one character's arc ends and another character's arc begins. Or if there's two characters having a conversation, then you can kind of go, that second character in the conversation becomes then the focus of the next story. There's also there's a guy named David Jouse who has some very interesting articles out there on writing or organizing short story collections. He wrote for something called the Writer's Chronicle. He talks about liaisons as being the principal cement that mortars our stories together in a unifying collection. And that's a keyword or image which repetition links two seeming stories together in a play, and thereby reveals an underlying connection. So if we think of maybe fairy tales, we think of Snow White, and then we got Snow White and Rose Red, which are two different narratives in a way, but there's an idea that we keep coming back to this idea of Snow White, and then maybe it's Rose Red, and then maybe it's Little Red Riding Hood, and then maybe it's the Three Little Pigs and the Wolf. So you keep coming with this rhythm that there's some symbolic or key value in one story that then leads in the next one. So it sets us up that you're constantly coming through, and it gives the reader somewhat of a roadmap, I think, to how that collection is organized and how in their minds they can understand the stories. Let's see what else we have here. Again, I said that shorter stories, or stories that really you don't think belong in the collection, maybe, especially the ones that don't belong in the collection, you maybe go with your gut instinct. If you've got 10 stories that are tight and you've got one extra story that you like it, but it doesn't have anything to really do the other 10, and you wrote it back when you were in graduate school, and just because you personally like it doesn't really mean it might not go to the collection, because overall you want this collection to be tight. You want all the stories to have that relationship to one another, whatever that relationship may be. So maybe save that second story as kind of a DVD extra. Maybe you post that online as a teaser story that says, this is also something that was included in the collection, but it's another one of my stories that I'm proud of. Because of course you want to also bring in your social media and your website and your blog, that when you start doing promotion for this collection, you want to be able to talk about it, and you want to have, I think that sort of idea of DVD extras is a fun idea, that those are things that will draw people into buying the collection, having reviewers review the collection, and then providing sort of this supplementary material that allows them to have another focus or another point with the collection itself. Again, as I mentioned, the title story, you may have a story that has a title that you love and you decide to name the collection after that. But again, that title story doesn't have to be the first story in the book if it's not the strongest one, if you feel others are stronger. Again, this idea of drawing the reader in, and as they're reading the stories, then they suddenly discover the fourth or fifth story is, oh, that's the one that's the title. Now I understand why the book cover is designed the way it is. I understand why the story is, sort of placed in this position. Flash fiction can be tough because all those stories are, somewhere between maybe 800 and 1,200 words if you're doing a flash fiction collection, which is also popular these days, that people have written enough flash fiction to have a collection. Well, a lot of times you'll do a Kickstarter for that. I have a friend, an author I publish, Jamie Lackey, who's coming out a flash fiction collection soon. And she's actually going to be organizing those in the order she wrote them in, because each of the stories has a storyline suggested by one of the backers on her Kickstarter campaign. So for her, organizing those in the order she writes them in is the one that makes the most sense for her. But that flash fiction can be interesting because those stories are all so small that it's sort of, you just keep biting away at them when you're reading the stories. So that rhythm can be, sort of extra hard. Same, as I said, applies to poetry in a way. Back when I was an assistant editor at Chronicle Press, and we received over 400 submissions a year, we would read the first story or the first poem. If that poem was strong, we'd read the last poem. If the last poem was strong, then we'd go and randomly read things in between in the collection. And it was a way to weed out 400 entries down to 20 or so that then were the ones we really wanted to look at. So having that first poem and that last poem, or that first story and that last story, can be really kind of a key make or break these days if you are responding to an open call. I just finished an open call for this fairy tale book I was working on. I had 140 entries over a 2-month period, and it was only me reading them. And oftentimes, as a publisher, you only have 1 or 2 people reading. So there's kind of, unfortunately, we've got to weed stories out. And if the story doesn't grab me from the first couple paragraphs, then I'm really going to probably toss that story. It's not going to be something I want to finish reading. So that is, again, a reason why to have a strong start and a strong end to things. That last story, then, that is also an interesting part of this process. A lot of people tend to just, as they're organizing stories, they've got them, and then I've got a couple extras I'm going to fit towards the end. I would say probably not do that. That you want your last story to be as strong as your first. You want people to have a sense of completing the book. They want people to think after, because that last story is really going to be the last kind of word, as it were. So much like the ending of a movie, you want something, you want people to, after they read the book, they want to think about the book. They want to go back to it maybe a week later and have that kind of thought process. So an ending, having a good, strong ending, is going to be something that's going to work very well for you. That ending can also be, if you are looking to self-publish, and this short story collection might be your entree that eventually doing a novel, that you've written a bunch of short stories in the same world that your novel is in. Maybe that last story becomes the lead-in to the novel. Maybe it is the prequel to the novel, or something that will be a teaser as to what the novel's about. And then as you start to develop a body of work in a canon, that people will go back and they'll sort of understand, and maybe they'll explore your collection, your short story collection, if they read your novella or actually read your novel, and they're going to start to think that, they're going to start to understand your world a little more. So that's kind of the rough outline of what I'm talking about. I tend to like to have these more be discussions, but I'm not sure how many people we have in chat or not. There's 7 watching, I see. So if Jennifer maybe wants to ask some questions, I respond a little better probably to that than just talking to my face on the screen here.
Well, so one thing that really struck me was the flash fiction project that you described, where the Kickstarter backers came up with the ideas for the stories. How did
Yes,
that
again,
work?
the story prompts.
Yeah, that's and how does that seem to be working?
I think very well for her. It engaged the Kickstarter backers into being part of the campaign. It
Sure.
allowed Jamie to have an extra level, so it's not just people buying the book, people actually kind of actively involved in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And those story prompts are sometimes rather obscure or hard to deal with, but Jamie's a great author, which is why I publish a lot of her stories myself. And so having something out of the blue for her to react to, I think has worked very well for her. It also allows her, when she's structuring the book, to have the story set up so that each opening pages, this was the story prompt for this story. Here's a little paragraph about me talking about what that engendered in me, and then here's the story. So it allows you to pad out the collection a little bit, but also allows you to have almost an introductory point to the stories. And also, if as we as writers, we're also readers, we do readings, and part of doing a reading is talking about the stories, introducing them, having those little pauses between stories to have people refocus. So that story prompts plus that intro is going to work really well for her in her collection, to provide that sort of pacing in the collection.
Sure. Do you, I mean, speaking of people who publish also being writers and readers, do you have an example that you could give to folks as far as how you structured a collection of your own?
Yes. I'll talk about two things. One is this fairy tale book, because that's the most recent thing I've been working on. That was actually a lot to do with 21 authors to try to put them in some sort of order. As I said, the authors all had 2 fairy tales they chose, plus a genre of their choice. So one thing I didn't want to do was load 3 or 4 science fiction stories, and then 3 or 4 fantasy stories, and then 3 or 4 steampunk stories. So I can actually reach you over here. So this is actually the galley proof, as it were. So I actually printed up all 20 of these stories, and I laid them out on the floor and began to organize them. I wanted to organize them so that no genre was repeated twice in a row. Very few of these stories overlap in terms of the fairy tales. I was able to get most of the fairy tales to be one-time onlys. There were a couple. There's Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella were both very popular fairy tales in the book. So again, it was trying not to have those two together. I wanted to have, there were, out of the 21, 3 of them were more humorous. So I knew I wanted to have those paced. Basically every third of the book, there would be one kind of fun story. There were some stories in here that are rather dark. There's a couple of horror stories. So again, we don't want to put those together in terms of their qualities. There are some stories about mermaids. There's some stories about selkies who are similar, but again, they're different. So again, pacing those out. So it was really about a week of looking at them and saying, okay, this is kind of the order I like, reading all the first couple of paragraphs of each, and then thinking about it a while and coming back downstairs again and moving them around a little bit. 3 of the authors in this book are also, these are their first time they published, had professional stories published of their work. So those I wanted to pace out a bit too. They have kind of authors or have the reader sort of discover those authors. I did fairly well in parity between authors who identify as male, authors who identify as female, and authors who identify as they and them. So again, it was trying to pace that out because you all have very different, unique voices. And I didn't want to have this sort of be, here's the first half of the book, which is all women authors, and here's the second half of the book, which is all male authors. So trying to pace those things out. So there's a lot of intricacy in that. And a lot of this is by feel. I mean, I've been doing this long enough that it's sort of, I almost just go with my gut and sort of subconscious process that, again, putting these out, the 21 stories, and just sort of looking at them and going, okay, I can rearrange this a bit, and this story is actually a little stronger here. Again, the first story and the last story, the first story in this book is on the dark side, but it is a lovely story by N.A. Sulway, who's an Australian writer. And it is a beautiful merging of two fairy tales. And then the last story is actually one that made me a little bit teary-eyed the first time I read it. And I really liked it because it ended on a very kind of happy note. So this sort of overarching idea of a fairy tale that we always end on happily ever after. I definitely wanted to end the book on that as well. In other cases, I have a book called Kilakolas, which is sort of Italo Calvino mixed with M. John Harrison, a set of prose poems of my own that I published last year. And that one was, in the stories, the character is wandering around the city of Kilakolas and going into places, but also then wandering around the streets. So I wanted to give this aspect to that collection of somebody, you following that person on their journey. So you're wandering around streets, and then you kind of go into this place, and you come back out, and you go walk down this street, and you go into this place and have this adventure, and you come back out, and you go into the crypt of this place. So that collection was really, in my head, almost a map of this person's journey around the city and kind of balancing those sort of elements. Some of those prose poems were 2 to 3 pages, some were half a page. So again, it was balancing that out too, so that you may have a slightly longer piece, then a shorter piece, and then a mid-sized piece, then a long piece. So that was sort of that rhythm to that. I've done a couple of collections of sort of made-up anthologies. Robert Desnos, as I said, was a surrealist, French surrealist poet. I did a book of all of his mythological poems, and those spanned his entire career from basically 1918 to about 1943. So that book I actually organized in date order because there are certain interior rhythms of his work that are present early on and then become more developed as they go along. And so organizing that collection in some sort of a date order really made sense because it was sort of, here he is, an introductory new writer, then he starts gaining some presence, and he starts being more assured, and he becomes a professional writer, and he becomes the writer who he becomes. And so you kind of follow him on his journey of how he became a stronger and stronger writer as he went on. He started out doing very surrealist kind of work, and then towards the end, because he was in the resistance, he was writing things that were classically themed, but they were done on purpose to be resistance writing to get around the Nazi censors at the time of the occupation in France. So that collection is interesting that way too, that he has these more freeform surrealist pieces to begin with, and then he ends on a poem that is very classical, not exactly a sonnet, but it's got much more of that sort of those older French and English forms to the writing. So that one was interesting in that sort of sense. So, and others, Polis. This is a book I did at the beginning of this year. I invited authors to write stories about a future Earth, 1,000 years of history, 1,000 words exactly for each story. So these, after I decided on the final 14 stories in the collection, I went and organized them in my head for the way I thought that the future history would work. So all the authors wrote without talking to one another. So I was creating 1,000 years of history in some sort of order. This book turned out to actually be very interesting because the authors all used one of 3 themes. Either water was becoming scarce on the Earth, they're trying to save their children by sending them off to other planets. And the third one was the sort of just general rise and fall of the Roman Empire, sort of decaying of society. So taking those 14 stories and organizing them in my head of what felt like a future history and how the stories sort of interconnected. So one story is talking about somebody saying that the Water Bureau was basically chasing them. And then later on, there's a story that takes place in space that they're bringing comets in to the orbit of Earth in order to bring more water back to Earth, because the entire city is covered by one city. The entire Earth is covered by one city. So this is sort of like, if you know Judge Dredd comics, or Coruscant from Star Wars, or Trantor from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. Since the entire Earth is covered by one city, they have sort of aquifers for water. So again, it was the Water Bureau, and then there's sort of these miners are bringing comets and ice they've mined from other planets back to Earth. And so it was kind of this logical progression of that. A few others here. This is a book I did last year as well, Cities in Dusk, Plains of Light. This is all women authors, and they're writing stories of science fantasy as the genre, which was the genre we had before science fiction, fantasy, and horror divided into separate sort of categories. So we're thinking 1920s, 1930s. There are actually a couple of women authors, including C.L. Moore and Lee Brackett, who's notable for writing the screenplay to The Empire Strikes Back. They were early writers in the 20s and 30s who helped define this genre. They are very important women writers. So this collection here was trying to organize the 5 women for the collection into some sort of order. Some of them tended more towards the fantasy end, some of them tended more towards the science fiction end. So this collection was really with only 5 stories. The order was a little easier to put together, but it's starting again with a strong start, which was a epistological story, and then ending on one that's a little more fantasy based. Had a really strong ending itself out of the collection. So it was working with that. So yeah, so it really depends per book. A lot of it's kind of a gut reaction, but you sort of have a roadmap in your head and how to sort of balance these things out. Now, of course, if you're being published, you're going to do your best effort of the story order, but that publisher's probably going to maybe change some of it a little bit, maybe rearrange some stories for how they feel is best. And so that's kind of thing. Do your best effort, show yourself off, your talents and your skills, and then work with the publisher to, if there needs to be some adjustment. I did that with a few books. Samantha Barrett is a local author who I published a few years ago as well. This is her book, The Bus to Adventure City. She writes both fantasy, science fiction, and horror stories, as well as sort of everyday stories that have a slightly tweaked Black Mirror or Twilight Zone-esque aspect to them. So her collection, I asked her to put her best idea in about what she felt the collection should be solid, and I then went and adjusted just a few of them. But we're really working with her. I tend to like to let the authors know their stories best, so I tend to have a kind of very light hand on editing as a publisher and letting them, if they feel strongly about something, that's then what I'll agree to go with, because they know their stories best, and these are their collections, and I want them to be proud of their books. So do we have any? Oh, we have some chat questions. What do you say to the person who says short story collection structure doesn't matter? People read these stories separately anyway. Well, that is also a good question, and it is one, especially with ebooks these days, and much with, I think, also records. These days, when you buy a record album, you don't listen to the songs in the order in which they were put on the album. You kind of just dip in and out. I would say that the structure still matters, and I think that if you start dipping in and reading the 3rd story, then the 5th story, and the 9th story, and back to the 2nd story, you're going to start to feel that there's a structure to this. A lot of times, successful story collections, I'll start reading them maybe that way, dipping into a few that I know that the story was published in Asimov's or published with Granta or was in this poetry magazine. But then I'll go through and read them sort of randomly, but then I'll go back and read them in the order in which the author had intended them to be read, especially if the collections are strong. There's a woman named Kid Johnson who I'm thinking of that she has a wonderful collection of stories out that I had read a few of, but kind of I reread those first to kind of familiarize myself again with her work, and then I read the book in order at that point. So it is tough because people are going to do what they're going to do, but I think the structure is important no matter what to your collection, and there are still people who buy physical books. There are people who read ebooks in order to. I know a lot of people who read magazines actually start at the last page of the magazine and read their way backwards through the magazine. So there's not much you can do in those cases. Oh, and there's Donna in Brazil, who I know. Hi, Donna. Apologies for joining late. Can you talk a little about the linked short stories versus a collection? So linked short stories oftentimes is a device that a lot of authors use when they're doing novels, that novels are really not novels per se. They are individual short stories. I just finished rereading all of Terry Dowling's book. He's an Australian author. He's written 4 collections of short stories about a character named Tom Tyson. And each of these 4 collections is a novel length and feels like a novel, but they're all made of short stories because he doesn't write Tom's stories in novelistic form. So those short stories are all individuals. So for him, and this new version of the books that came out, there's actually a volume with kind of a behind the scenes and him talking about each of the stories and where they come from. And the order in which the stories were written or published was not the order in which the stories appeared in the book. So for him, it was building those kind of connections, that ending a story on a sandstorm, let's say, then maybe the next story starts not on a sandstorm per se, but maybe it's an aftermath of that. So you're going to find these sort of interior aspects of the stories and link them together. He tends to do, again, the pacing where it's a couple of serious stories and then maybe there's a lighter one, but maybe that lighter one has a little detail about this particular character he mentions. And then 2 stories later, that character becomes one of the main characters in the story. So you're looking, I think, for that case, opportunities in your short stories to link them together in subtle ways or maybe in more direct ways, depending on the narrative structures. But I really kind of like those kind of books where it's a novel that's made of short stories, because I sort of get this sort of surrealistic sense, they're sort of jumping from one thing to another, that the narrative jumps and you've got to kind of go along with the journey rather than having a novel, which you're really kind of building things one by one. So versus a collection in that case, all the things we sort of talked about before, the sort of idea of mosaics or hourglasses, or the sort of rhythm to the stories of having long stories and short stories and long stories and the medium story, that is the better, I think, organization for that type of collection. Because those stories may be so disparate and not attached to one another. So you really are kind of relying on the pacing of the story. Again, if this is like a symphony, or this is like a meal, we have the salad course, the dinner course, the cheese course, the dessert course. Those can all be different things, but the wine you're drinking during the meal is tying all that together in terms of the flavors. You may start out with a salad course with almonds in it, and then the dessert is an almond cookie. So look for those kind of internal little rhythms. And if you're trying to organize things that are very different from one story to another, that's the way to do that. Now, again, you are the writer of all these stories, so you also have that as your sort of line along the meal, that you are the ones writing all the stories. So it's your voice. Even if you kind of write things in different manners, there's still always going to be kind of your voice to your stories. So use that to your best benefit in terms of the organization. So I see you, Donna. Do we have any others, or do you want to ask something, Jennifer?
Well, a question that I have, your that collection of the French poet, you also did the translation for that?
Yes, I know translations, yes.
So I'm wondering if you could also talk about translation while I happen to have you here, and
Sure.
what that experience is like, especially working with something like surrealist poems.
Yes, and Desnos is a interesting case. I fell in love with his work while I was in college in my 20s, and only about 10% of his work at that time was translated in English. So I ran out of things to read. So out of desperation, I started translating myself his work just to have it to read. And I started getting a little better at that. I'm now one of the principal translators of him in the US with 5 books of work out there. Translating is an interesting school of thought. There are literal translators who translate things really quite literally word for word, and then there's sort of poetic translators. So a literal translator may translate something as a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. But a poetic translator may translate that more as the birds in the trees are worth their weight in singing, or something like that. So you're trying always, you're never going to translate anything perfect, because the languages there's always some other color to the languages. So you tend to want to see, do you translate that as, I find the literal translations actually sometimes really kind of dull the work. They're all the words, but they don't have the kind of spark. And for Desnos, he is so lyrical and such a wonderful writer. He was probably the greatest poet of the 20th century of France, at least of the mid part of the century. Just an absolutely beautiful writer and very complex. There are things of his that can never be translated, but his work has a really lyric quality to it. And while translating these various books, I knew when I was getting it right, because it just felt like his voice in there to me. Now, I had a lot of really great translators who have done his work to start out with, so I had an idea in my head of what he sort of sounded like. As with Shakespeare or any other writer, there are certain words you use over and over again, so his sort of vocabulary. So I can't pick up a Le Monde and read the whole newspaper, but his work, because the words are repetition and he has sort of structures to his writing and sort of a weft and weave to his writing, in translating those books over time, I sort of developed that voice in myself. And he actually really colored a lot of my own poetry. He has some just amazing last lines to poems. There's one, just me, Robert Desnos, who for having loved you doesn't want to be remembered for anything else on this despicable earth, which is just really just lovely, punchy last line. But I learned a lot about being a poet from him and how to sort of write poetry. He did write a few novels as well. He wrote a lot of spoonerisms. He wrote a lot of things that can't be translated. He has a famous 2-line poem where both lines are pronounced the same way in French. And it's basically in English, it's why am I attracted to Teresa? I'm attracted to her because of her magnetism. But that you can't translate that from English to, or from French to English in that way. He makes up a lot of compound words. There's a beautiful poem of his about weeping fruit and various things that he just slams these sort of French words together to make compound words, which don't make sense in English. So much of French writing also, language, you can have multiple meanings for the same word. So there's a famous poem of his called Bouquet, which he gives 3 roses, 3 pansies, 3 marigolds to his love, Yuki. But marigolds are the flower of worry. Pansy in French is pensée, which is also the word for thought. So in fact, what he's giving are 3 tears, 3 glances, 3 blushes to his girlfriend, 3 thoughts about her. But if you're reading in French, you're seeing both those levels operating at the same time. But in English, I actually pulled it into 2 separate poems. So one is just, I'm giving these various flowers to her, but then I'm also giving these various sort of feelings or thoughts about her to her. So that becomes one of the key strategies to doing a lot of his poems, is providing translations that are separated but show all aspects at the same time to the work. I've also been very influenced by W.S. Merwin as a translator. He's definitely one of the more lyric translators. He will have a lot of times a speaker of whatever language, let's say it's Cherokee, will do the base translation, and then he'll come back in and sort of pull out of that the lyric poetry of whatever the piece is. And so he tends to be more of the lyric side rather than the sort of literal side. For Desnos, William Kulik, K-U-L-I-K, is probably the best known sort of literal translator of Desnos's work, by people like Marianne Cause, Michael Benedict, Carolyn Forche. There's sort of varying levels. Michael Benedict tends more towards the lyric side of things in his work. So it's a real kind of balance. There's a very famous poem of Desnos's that he's had written for a girlfriend of his at the time, Yvonne George, who was a dancehall singer that Desnos used to buy her heroin for her. She eventually wound up in a sanatorium with consumption and died. But there's a famous poem of his that he's talking, that he's the dream and she's the reality, and then she becomes the dream, he becomes the reality. And there's a middle line called "Oh, Scales of Feeling." And it's actually literally the scales, the weighing scales have tipped, and so they shift positions. And if you read this poem in like 8 or 10 different translations, everyone has a different sort of line of "Oh, scales of feeling," "Oh, balances of sentimentality." So it really kind of colors the way you perceive that poem. And some are just downright terrible. Some are more poetic. So it was a lot of reading of what I could find, and then started doing translations myself. And yeah, there's a book of his, Callisto, which was a long resistance poem he wrote in the during the sort of mid days of the war before he was captured by the Gestapo. And there were 6 pages in the middle of that book that are actually in French slang that most French readers don't even can read now, because it's sort of 1940s slang. So I got a French slang to British slang dictionary, and then I used the literal translation that they published in France of the piece, plus the Argot slang translation they had, or the original version, So it took me 6 months to do those 6 pages because it was so intensive of what does the slang mean in French, and then what I can find in the British dictionary that it means, and then converting it in kind of 40s gangster slang, because the whole thing is really kind of a take on a sort of American gangster, sort of speak at the time too. So it's then translating that again into a sort of third language of American gangster slang. So yeah, so 6 months for 6 pages of translating. But yeah, Callisto, I'm the first translator to do that in English as a full book. So it's a beautiful, beautiful book too. Yeah. So he was a really interesting person. He's a fabulous writer. I would encourage people to read him. He was eventually captured by the Gestapo. He was a newspaper reporter for many years, much to the chagrin and hatred of Andre Breton. And he was eventually demoted in the occupation to being a janitor, but he was still forging papers for people. He had hid people in his apartment for the resistance. He was doing that. And there's a story about at the time there was a writer who was part of the occupation, who was basically a traitor, and Desnos was the third person to publicly slap him. So all the guys on the side of the resistance were doing this, and so he got put on the list. And he was around the corner from where he lives at a bar, and he found out that his wife Yuki, the Gestapo, had visited her, so he rushed over to save her because he didn't want her to be tortured. So she threw down a coat to him down. That's in one of the famous photographs of him down the stairs. They arrested him, they sent him off to Compagnie, which was the French concentration camp. Then he eventually went to all the horrible camps. He died of typhoid fever, but he was liberated. There's a wonderful story about his final poem being translated into Czechoslovakian and then back into French, and it being sort of this idea of a new poem, but it really wasn't. It just was a bad translation in Czechoslovakian and back into French. But this poem appears at the Holocaust Memorial in Paris behind Notre Dame. That's carved in the wall there because France needed their heroes at the time, and Desnos became one of those people. But he was a really wonderful guy. He, at one point, Yuki Montparnasse was in jail in the South, and so he got all kinds of people together and got the jail money, and they rented a car, and they all drove down to the south of France to free her from jail. But he really cared about people, and he just was a really interesting person. Those of us who are privileged enough to translate him or work with him, we consider him a friend, even though we've never met him. He was the first person to do sound effects on the radio in France. He had a show, Dreams. People would send in their dreams by mail, and they would then stage the dream on the radio, and then he would tell them what the dream meant. And there are actually a couple of recordings, very rare recordings of him actually doing that, which is kind of fun. He was the one who brought Cuban jazz music to Paris. He was on a press junket to Cuba and brought back records. So the whole kind of 1930s Cuban jazz wave in Paris was in large part due to him. So yeah, beautiful, beautiful writer, real interesting person. There's maybe now about 20% of his work's been translated. So there's a lot of, there are things out there to find and read of his. So, but I digress.
No, but thank you for such a rich digression.
Sure.
How lovely that is. And I think we're up against our time boundary.
Okay.
Todd, thank you so much.
Sure. I'll put my little plug in at aanpress.com for the press and ordering books. Help out small presses, of course. So thank you very much for your time today, and those who tuned in and those who will tune in the future. And Jennifer, I think, will make my contact info known to those who want to ask any other questions or follow up stuff. So yeah, so this has been fun. Thanks.